appreciate you being here and taking your time to join us for Let Women Vote, the History of the 19th Amendment. And I'm very pleased to be working again with Dianne Herman of the League of Women Voters. She did Barriers to Voting presentation at the beginning of the summer, and we're glad to have her back for this presentation. I had thought that this topic, the anniversary 100th year of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, would be getting a lot more attention, and other things have been going on in our lives. So I'm glad that we're able to at least have this presentation from Wright Library for you. I do want to let you guys know that the library is doing, actually we just set up an exhibit at the library, and there will be an accompanying presentation on August 23rd, and that is The Fall of the American Dressmaker. The presentation's by Angela Reichelderfer, and she got a master's in public history, and her dissertation or thesis was on this topic. And she's actually a seamstress also, and she actually made the dresses that are on display here at the library. And her topic follows today's topic quite closely, in that the growing freedom that women enjoyed towards the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and those social struggles, I guess, kind of mirrored in the roles and the work that women were doing. And so being a dressmaker and the change over time, kind of the emancipation of women leading also to the demise of that occupation. Anyway, I hope you can join us, and I was hoping to be able to upload some flyer so that you could have that information. If I can't figure out how to do that, I will send an email with that information. We also have a reading list and resource list for today's program that I will share with you that way also. So the Richard Diaz at the Miami Valley Communications Council put together a video of Dianne's presentation. And so we're going to go ahead and show that, and we'll get started. In just a second, I'll switch my screen over to the video. After the video has run, Dianne will be here to answer questions, and you can put those questions in the chat or use the Q&A function, and she'll be here to answer your questions. So without further ado, I'm going to switch my screen and get that video playing. One other note, when I get the video playing, you will have viewing options. You may see that at the top of your screen already. You're welcome to change those however best suits your viewing. So if you see myself or Dianne in part of your screen, you can actually make us disappear so you're just seeing the video. So here we go.
I'm Dianne Herman, coordinator of the Speakers Bureau for the League of Women Voters of the Greater Dayton area. And today we're going to talk about the history of the 19th Amendment, which is the story of women's suffrage. And the story of women's suffrage is the story of one of the greatest social movements in American history. The sheer drama of the suffrage movement has few equals in our history. And while this story has been mostly overlooked in American history, one historian has written, quote, "The struggle for women's voting rights was one of the longest, most successful, and in some respects, most radical challenges ever posed to the American system of electoral politics," end quote. As leaders of the movement, when the 19th Amendment was eventually added to the Constitution, guaranteeing the women the right to vote after over 70 years of hard work, Carrie Chapman Catt and Nettie Rogers Schuler stated about the protracted effort, quote, "Hundreds of women gave the accumulated possibilities of an entire lifetime. Thousands gave years of their lives. Hundreds of thousands gave constant interest in such aid as they could. It was a continuous, seemingly endless chain of activity. Young suffragists who helped forge the last links of that chain were not born when it began. Old suffragists who forged the first links were dead when it ended." It all started at a meeting of the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London in 1840. The Americans had sent a delegation, including women who were active in the abolitionist movement. When the convention ruled that only men be seated, among the women compelled to sit passively were Lucretia Mott and the young wife of an abolitionist leader, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. The irony that women who were active in the great reform movements of the day were rebuffed and not allowed to officially participate led many, such as the Grimke sisters, who were gifted public speakers on the issue of slavery, to argue that the question of equality for women was not a matter of abstract justice, but must be undertaken so that women could be enabled to join in the urgent task of social reform, especially the fight to abolish slavery. It was in the abolitionist movement that women first learned to organize, to hold public meetings, to conduct petition campaigns, and finally to learn to advocate for their rights. So in 1848, Mott and Stanton and 3 other Quaker women decided to call a women's rights convention at the Wesleyan Chapel in Seneca Falls, New York, where Mrs. Stanton lived, to discuss the social, civil, and religious rights of women. There was plenty of lively discussion, and many resolutions were introduced and passed unanimously, except for one, which was carried by only a small margin, being considered too radical at the time, the call for women to have the right to vote. Even Mrs. Mott felt that the proposal would make the women reformers look ridiculous, but some supported Mrs. Stanton, including Frederick Douglass, the great black abolitionist, who approved of Mrs. Stanton's daring proposal. Conventions continued to be held, but with the outbreak of the Civil War, all activities for women's rights were suspended, while efforts of the leaders of the women's cause were directed to the abolitionist issue. When the war ended and the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution were passed, abolishing slavery and extending the vote to black men, the suffragists felt betrayed when the right to vote was not extended to women. But they continued with their campaign, first seeking the vote on a state-by-state basis, and then through a federal amendment. The suffragists used a variety of tactics over the years of their struggle to win the vote. One of their first focuses was on public education through speaking and circulating publications. They distributed literature to schools and libraries and sponsored debates. They had their own newspapers, Susan B. Anthony's The Revolution, and Lucy Stone's The Woman's Journal. They mobilized through women's clubs and, yes, even book clubs. They were great marketers. Thousands of banners, buttons, posters, sashes, postcards, and even Mother Goose nursery rhymes with the suffragist twist were used to publicize votes for women. Jack and Jill have equal will and equal strength in mind, but when it comes to equal rights, poor Jill trails far behind. They use symbols such as the herald, female figures in various forms blowing a trumpet, holding a sword, carrying a torch, often coupled with sunbursts to portray a new day for women. Tableaus, which were theatrical demonstrations popular at the time, involved suffrage themes staged in public parks and alongside monuments. Colors of yellow to connote light and the role of women as enlighteners, white for purity, and purple for loyalty and dignity were used in suffrage campaigns. There were also great parades, marches, and open-air meetings, the most impressive being the parade organized by Alice Paul in 1913 during President Woodrow Wilson's inaugural, featuring more than 5,000 suffragists spectacularly arrayed with costumes, banners, bands, floats, and led by the striking Inez Mulholland in flowing white robes on a white horse. In a strategy they called the New Departure, they challenged the system through the courts. The suffragists argued that the newly enacted 14th Amendment said everyone born in the United States was a citizen. Therefore, as women were citizens, they had the same rights as men, including the right to vote. Acting on this argument, Susan B. Anthony and a group of women convinced men at the voter registration office to allow them to vote. After Anthony voted, she was arrested and tried in court for illegal voting in 1873. She was fined $100, a fine which she never paid. When a similar case made it to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1875, the court ruled that the vote is not a right of citizenship. As Anthony said, "The laws," she said, "are made by men, under a government of men, interpreted by men, and for the benefit of men. The only chance women have for justice in this country is to violate the law as I have done, and as I shall continue to do." Alice Paul, of the more militant wing of the suffragist movement in its later stages, was one of the first Americans to employ new tactics of civil disobedience, being the first, for example, to picket the White House for a political cause, and after being arrested, arguing that she was a political prisoner and going on a hunger strike. She and her sister protesters were subjected to forced feedings, a brutal and dangerous procedure. The suffragists worked state by state to place women's suffrage on the ballot. They lobbied Congress and testified at hearings, dubbed by the press as the, quote, front door lobby, because of the contrast between their open and honest methods and those more common among Washington lobbyists. The suffragists kept constant watch over members of Congress and continued to work hard to convince politicians to support women's suffrage. Women from all parts of the nation came in relays to reinforce those stationed at the national organization's Washington headquarters. They studied congressmen with microscopic intensity, seeking the right words or arguments with which to persuade them to support the federal amendment. It had long since become clear to the suffragists that justice arguments alone would not be sufficient. Politicians had to be convinced that it was expedient for them personally, as well as for their party, to support women's suffrage. They traveled the country by car and train with the suffragist special, crisscrossing the nation, trying to gain support through publicity. They forged strategic alliances. The suffrage movement won a valuable ally when Frances Willard, as president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which sought to outlaw alcohol consumption, led thousands of otherwise traditional women to convert to the cause of women's suffrage as a way to protect the home, women, and children from the ravages of the drink. The progressive movement, which began around 1900 at the grassroots level and swept both national political parties, sought to advocate for reforms such as pure food and drug legislation, legal protection for workers, an end to child labor, and legislation to curb political corruption. Many progressives believed that women's vote would help obtain such reforms, such as the revered Jane Addams, founder of the famous Chicago settlement house, Hull House. They benefited from inspired leadership and applied huge amounts of effort with persistence and commitment. Carrie Chapman Catt recounted from the time the first women's suffrage amendment was introduced in Congress in 1878, quote, "Over 52 years, women conducted 56 campaigns of referenda to male voters, 480 campaigns to get legislatures to submit suffrage amendments to voters, 47 campaigns to get state constitutional conventions to write women's suffrage into state constitutions, 277 campaigns to get state party conventions to include women's suffrage campaign planks in their party platforms, and 19 campaigns with 19 successive Congresses. Many were willing to sacrifice their resources and even their health by going to jail and engaging in hunger strikes. Some even died, such as Inez Mulholland, suffering from ill health, but who insisted on conducting a strenuous speaking tour, which resulted in her death from exhaustion, and who became a martyr to the cause as a result. It is a testament to the suffragists that today's generations wonder that it took over 70 years for women to gain the right to vote in America. For many of us, it's a no-brainer. But this was a protracted struggle because the suffragists had so many obstacles to overcome. Their first obstacle was the traditional social role of women in the United States at the time. For the fight for the vote was also a fight to change the social, economic, and legal status of women. Women were perceived to be inferior to men and were relegated to the domestic sphere. In 19th century America, women were denied access to training and education, and they were prevented from receiving the same pay as men for similar work. Women also faced legal discrimination, especially if they were married. Women were unable to control their own earnings, manage property, or sign legal papers. Women's traditional role in the family meant that they were relegated to the private sphere of the home, with responsibilities to run the household and care for the children in the days before labor-saving technology allowed time from mundane chores and before birth control allowed freedom from childbirth. This meant that women frequently lacked the resources of time, energy, and money to engage in pursuits outside the home. The definition of femininity meant that it was unladylike for women to pursue a career or engage in public activities, for this might mean the destruction of the family. Women's fragility meant that they should be shielded from the rough and tumble of politics. Those opposed to women's suffrage would claim that the suffragists were in favor of sex freedom, easy divorce, trial marriage, state care of children, birth control, and other destructive theories. If women won the right to vote, it would mean the destruction of the home and all of society. The suffragists expended much time and energy attempting to dispel these notions and to argue that women's suffrage would improve society, as women would be advocates for change, such as good government, and yes, even be better mothers with the vote. Another obstacle facing the suffragists was that women are a heterogeneous, not a homogeneous group, influenced by class, race, marital and educational status, religious and even regional, urban, and rural divisions. Women in the South were influenced by the very traditional and conservative values tied to enforcing white supremacy, and the Catholic Church and most other major religious denominations were clear in their rejection of women's suffrage. The values of the time concerning women's traditional roles and personal affiliations meant many women felt loyalty to their husbands, families, religious beliefs, and communities, which fractured women from taking a united stand in favor of women's suffrage. Attempts to organize women meant overcoming ignorance, apathy, hopelessness, and the habit of submission, in addition to working with a group which lacked resources, experience, and a cohesive identity as women. In addition, major institutions were aligned against women's rights, including religious groups, as we've said, political parties, major industries, especially the textile and garment industries, and most especially the liquor and saloon industries. The alliance of the suffragists with the temperance movement resulted in the arousing of a powerful opponent in the liquor industry, which saw women voting as a threat to be stopped at all costs. Many believe that this group's powerful manipulation of American politics long delayed the coming of women's suffrage. And anytime we look at historical change in America, the issue of race emerges as a divisive one. While the suffrage movement had historically been aligned with the rights of blacks and the abolishment of slavery, white female suffragists increasingly became indignant that black men won the vote ahead of them and angry at the ease with which immigrant men were enfranchised. In fact, the issue of race became so problematic in the suffrage movement that it led to a split in the movement shortly after the end of the Civil War, with Stanton and Anthony arguing against the adoption of the 15th Amendment and forming the National Woman's Suffrage Association, and Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell supporting adoption of the black male vote, as this was now the Negro's hour, and forming the American Women's Suffrage Association. In 1890, the two groups reunited to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association, also known as NASA. At this point, the suffragists felt that they would need the support of the southern states if they were to be successful with the federal amendment to the Constitution. With the renewed ascendancy of white supremacy in the South after Reconstruction, the suffragists began to use a strategy first suggested by Henry Blackwell, a prominent abolitionist and husband to Lucy Stone. They argued that women's suffrage, far from endangering white supremacy in the South, could be a means of restoring it. They suggested that the adoption of women's suffrage with educational or property qualifications would disqualify most black women and would allow the South to restore white supremacy in politics without having to disenfranchise black males and risk congressional repercussions. The Nassau spent considerable time and resources developing this Southern strategy, sending their leaders on speaking tours throughout the region and holding the 1895 NASA convention in Atlanta, and even asking their aging hero, Frederick Douglass, not to attend for fear of offending their Southern hosts. But pitting one group against another seldom works in either's interests, and it soon became obvious that Southern politicians were not persuaded to destroy women's traditional role as they proceeded to institute Jim Crow laws to block black male voters' access to the ballot. And despite white suffragist exclusion of African American women from white suffragist organizations, many prominent African Americans actively supported women's suffrage from its very beginning, such as the former slave Sojourner Truth with her famous "Ain't I a Woman" speech at one of the first conventions, to Ida B. Wells, famous as a leading crusader against lynching, and Mary Church Terrell, educator and first president of the National Association of Colored Women. Adela Hunt Logan, Tuskegee faculty member, insisted that if white women needed the vote to protect their rights, then black women, victims of racism as well as sexism, needed the ballot even more. Class divisions were also apparent in the movement. Many upper-class men and women opposed extending the vote to women. As guardians of the status quo, they perceived the suffragist movement as a threat to social stability, an attack on the family and women's traditional roles. Unfortunately, many suffragists of white middle-class origins also expressed anti-immigrant sentiments, arguing that educated white women were more deserving of the franchise than ignorant lower-class immigrant males who frequently voted against suffrage. Some suggested that the votes of native-born white women could counter the foreign menace, and that an educational qualification for voting would disenfranchise unfit voters. But eventually, the obstacles of women's traditional roles, powerful interests, religious objections, political parties, race, and class were overcome, and the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified in August 1920. It states, quote, The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. The exact wording drafted by Susan B. Anthony in 1878. And the suffragists have still not gone away. They've just morphed into the League of Women Voters, formed out of the suffragist movement by the last leader of the national organization, Carrie Chapman Catt, in 1920, who saw that now that we have the vote, what are we going to do with it? Make sure that our democracy is protected by encouraging an engaged and informed citizenry, the mission of the League. And yet, while we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment and the beginnings of the League of Women Voters, from which the struggle to win the vote emerged, American history is a little more complicated. White women did win the vote in 1920. But in fact, almost all women of color were not enfranchised by the 19th Amendment. For Black women, especially in the South, they were blocked from voting by the institution of Jim Crow laws after the failure of Reconstruction in the 1870s. It would not be until the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 that African Americans gained access to the ballot in the South. The Indian Citizenship Act was passed in 1924, but Western states, especially Montana and South Dakota, have continued to erect barriers to Native American voters. Chinese Americans were granted citizenship and the right to vote in 1943. Other Asian Americans were not entitled to vote until 1952, when the McCarran-Walter Act overturned the Asian Exclusion Act of 1924. For Hispanic Americans, the struggle to achieve voting rights began with the Guadalupe-Hidalgo Treaty in 1848, which ended the Mexican-American War. Mexican Americans faced similar nullification of voting rights as blacks in the South, with local laws requiring English proficiency tests and property requirements, in addition to local vigilante violence. It wasn't until the renewal of the Voting Rights Act in 1975 that language barriers were addressed. And let's not forget the citizens of Washington, D.C., and the U.S. territories Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, and Guam, who are not entitled to the vote. So, the work of the suffragists to secure the vote for more of our citizens continues, as the League of Women Voters addresses barriers to voting, such as making registering to vote more difficult by limiting Department of Motor Vehicle offices in rural, poor, and minority communities, requiring difficult to obtain state-issued voter identification, limiting early voting, discouraging voting by mail, restricting access to absentee ballots, providing few polling locations resulting in long lines to vote, and purges of voter rolls, to mention a few. The vote is the foundation of democracy, but it is a right that has to be continuously defended.
All right. That was fantastic. Again, kudos to Richard Diaz of the Miami Valley. Hold on. Sorry, I had something still playing in the background. I apologize for that. So, all right. So that was wonderful, Diane. Really well done. So now it's time for our audience to chime in and ask questions. Anyone who has a question can put it in the chat, or you can use the Q&A functionality and ask away. Does anybody have something they would like to talk about?
Anybody have any questions, for example, about I guess the current controversy about voting by mail, and how we do that in Ohio? There are several states, especially in the West. There are several states, especially in the West, who do all mail-in voting, and they're red states or blue states, however you characterize that. Utah and Oregon being all mail voting. There's no difference between an absentee ballot and a mail-in ballot also. I think that's a distinction that people are trying to make that's not accurate. And in Ohio, as in most states, we have what you call no-fault absentee ballot. In some states, you have to have some excuse as to why you can't make it physically to the polls. You don't have to prove that in Ohio. You can just say, I want to vote by home, and send me my ballot, and I'll send it back in. And the security on the mail-in ballots is just as valid as they are with in-person voting. They have ways of tracking the ballot, and then also checking to see that the signatures coincide. So there's practically no evidence of fraud, either with in-person or absentee or early voting methods.
Looks like we have a couple more questions coming in the chat. So Michael wonders, when did Ohio grant women the right to vote?
In 1920, when the amendment passed, the federal amendment passed. Our neighbor, Indiana, granted women the right to vote in 1917. And in fact, in Ohio, women did win the vote in 1917 through an initiative, but it was overturned shortly thereafter with the opposition mobilizing to challenge the granting of the vote. So then we had to wait to 1920. But Ohio ratified the 19th Amendment right away. There was even people who had voted against it voted for it. Okay. So a couple of other questions too.
Mm-hmm. So I'll answer the one about the books. Jennifer, we have a reading list that we're going to share by email. And it doesn't include books that are appropriate for children.
I think there was one that I recommended for juvenile readers that I gave you, Brian.
Yeah, so I've got that on the list. And like I said, I'll share that via email after the presentation.
Can people read questions? Okay, let's see. There was something about the Woodrow Wilson.
So Jennifer also says, wasn't the Wilson administration and the Democrats in general opposition, generally opposed to women's suffrage?
Yes.
And it was actually the Republican Party that supported?
The Republicans as a party supported the the federal amendment more than the Democratic Party. And Woodrow Wilson, he was from the South. So especially his wife, she was vehemently opposed to women's suffrage, but he was no fan either. He tried to fend off the suffragists as much as he could. He really didn't like Alice Paul, especially when she picketed at his White House and embarrassed him. But he had a hard time maintaining that position because there reached a critical point where I think I lost everybody here. Brian?
I can hear you.
Oh, okay. the midterm elections in the second term, his political colleagues told him, listen, this women's suffrage thing, if we don't get on board with it, we're going to lose votes. So it became politically expedient for the Democratic Party to support women's suffrage. Hope that answered the question. And also he had a hard time because he was saying that World War I was the war to bring democracy to the world. And so he was caught in his hypocrisy and was very much embarrassed by it. So that was another impetus. And also during war times, there are big social shifts that take place. And women were very active in the war campaign, even though Carrie Chapman Catt was a Quaker and very, very much opposed to war, as were many of the women in the women's suffrage movement. And so, especially the white middle class women. And so for them to support the war effort, Catt reminded Wilson that he owed the women, because the women were in the forefront for going out and raising vegetables and conserving food, running war bond campaigns, and even participating in the war effort. The suffragists sponsored a bunch of women physicians to go over to France to establish hospitals. So they did all kinds of things to support the war effort, and they reminded Wilson that he owed them, and he was aware of that also.
Okay. So Kathy's wondering, what kind of influence do you think that Alice Paul's use of militant tactics played in the role of the adoption of the 19th Amendment?
Well, it's interesting in that you see this in many social movements, and even at the very beginning of the suffrage movement, after the Civil War, where there was a split with a more radical group being Susan B. Anthony and Katie Stanton, and a more conservative group being Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell. And they fought over tactics in the first split, with Stone, of course, and Blackwell supporting the 15th Amendment and arguing for a state-by-state approach to win the vote, with Stanton and Anthony arguing for, listen, if we don't get the vote, nobody should get the vote, and we're going to be more militant about it and go for a federal amendment. And then the second, after the Civil War and a period of not much progress, with the turn of the century, after 1900 and the progressive movement, and then World War I, those social changes moved the movement along. But there again, there was a split in the movement, with Carrie Chapman Catt arguing for more mainstream approaches and trying to use persuasion, and Alice Paul arguing for more militant tactics, such as the picketing approach. So, but those tensions, I think, are healthy in social movements for change. Because if you don't have that more radical wing of the movement, they kind of give cover for the middle of the road. And so Carrie Chapman Catt can come across as looking at very mainstream and reasonable, so that she can gain credibility and say, look at, they start to look not so radical, even though what Catt was arguing for, the 19th Amendment, was the same as what Paul was. It was just a difference in tactics. But those variety of tactics are sometimes what needs to happen for the movement to move forward. So both the more moderate wing and the more radical wing in the later stages of suffrage, women's suffrage, were important for the eventual success.
So Kathy had a follow-up. Would states have adopted women's suffrage without the federal 19th Amendment? being
not in the
advocated?
South. Mississippi didn't um, uh, accept the 19th Amendment until 1984. So what is that, 64 years later? They needed the Federal Amendment as the way to get it done.
Tiffany has a question here. How does the League of Women Voters work with intersectional politics, social justice now? And do you think that women have sufficiently addressed the prejudice of the early years of the movement?
There's still a lot of work to be done in terms of sexism in our society. And when you encounter sexism, as we've seen before, there's other groups too that are impacted. For example, African-American women have to face the issues of racism as well as sexism. So if you're going to fight sexism, you have to end up fighting racism too. So the whole concept of intersectionality has become recognized in many social movements now, where it's seen that, you know, if the rights of one group are taken away, then that can threaten the rights of other groups. And so you have to take a multifaceted approach. And I think that's one of the strengths of the League of Women Voters, going back to the first part of the question, which is they provide a service to society in that we operate voter registration drives, we educate people, which is part of what this program is about our history and about voting rights. The League, though, also takes a very active and advocacy kind of approach by filing federal lawsuits. Right now, for example, the Ohio League is closely monitoring what our Secretary of State is doing in terms of the upcoming presidential elections and some concerns over that. But the League also takes policy positions and advocates for policies. So for example, the National League has policy positions that are well researched and approved by consensus of all of the different constituents of the League. So for example, there's a lot of policies addressing climate change and conservation, of course, legal and political rights. Good government and recommendations for that. So for example, one of the current campaigns of the League is to abolish the Electoral College because it's not seen as democratic and it is harmful actually to our system of government. It's an antiquated system. And the League takes a position on that. So the League is indeed an intersectional organization in terms of addressing a variety of topics that the League feels are in the best interests of American citizens. I hope I answered that question.
So we have a couple related questions. Elizabeth's wondering if there's a way for her to volunteer for voter registration, absentee ballot assistance. And then Donna is asking what we as concerned citizens can do to turn out to vote.
Well, all of the counties in Ohio are looking for poll workers. So that's one way to you do get paid, but you may as well consider it volunteer for the number of hours it requires. But you could be a poll worker. You can join the League. We usually run voter registration drives. We go to all the summer festivals and so forth to try to provide information and voter registration forms. But of course, with the virus and public gatherings limited, our voter registration efforts are somewhat limited, of course. But You can pick up a voter registration form at any public library. You can go to the Montgomery County Board of Elections website, or you can go to the Secretary of State of Ohio's website to get voter information and voter forms, including absentee forms. If you have moved and you have moved outside the precinct that you currently resided in, you must re-register to vote. So if you have moved, and in these turbulent times, I'm very concerned about people getting evicted, and so contact your Board of Elections if you have any questions about issues of not having a stable address and how you can vote. And of course, you can always call the League of Women Voters offices and we can answer your questions. Or you can go online to Vote 411, which will provide voter information. Donna's, I forgot what Donna's question was.
She was just looking for suggestions of how to help get the vote, turn out the vote.
So some of those are some suggestions that we have.
Yeah,
we want, of course, we want everybody to vote. That's the basis of our democracy.
So Anne says that she recently heard that League of Women Voters was concerned about absentee ballots in Ohio being certified valid before being counted based on signature.
Yes.
How does that work?
There's some concern because one of the ways that they verify the authenticity or the accuracy of the ballot is by voter signature. And there's some concerns, and what the League of Women Voters of Ohio, I should clarify, the League of Women Voters is structured just like our federal government is, just like our government is structured. So we have a national office for federal issues. We have state league offices. So we have a League of Women Voters of Ohio, and then we have local leagues, usually organized on the county level. And so the League of Women Voters of the Greater Dayton area is Greene and Montgomery counties. And then we have a League of Women Voters of Ohio. Jen Miller, who is executive director of the League of Women Voters of Ohio, is concerned that there are no clear directions to their satisfaction about how to verify the signatures. And since Board of Election persons are not forensic and hand analysis verifiers, she would like to see more clear directions on verification of signatures. I hope that answers the question. That was in today's Dayton Daily News, by the way.
Beverly's wondering how the 1918-19 flu epidemic affected the movement.
Well, actually, Carrie Chapman Catt came down with the flu. It was called the Spanish flu, even though it wasn't from Spain. But so it did cripple the effort for a while, and the suffragists complained about it. They were many times immobilized, just as we are now, with this disease. And of course, the numbers of casualties were enormous. And of course, it occurred during wartime also. So many of our military were infected and ended up killed as a result of the disease and not necessarily just of the war. So it was a terrible time, and it did negatively impact the efforts for a period of time during the during the year of 1918.
Great. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions. I have to say, I think it's entirely appropriate that we're having this discussion in a presidential election year. And it's very interesting with Beverly mentioning, the flu back at, at 1918, how similar that situation must have been. Here's another question. Jennifer's wondering how many members do you have as part of the local League of Women Voters? Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you for that question. The League of Women Voters of the Greater Dayton area was one of the first leagues to be formed, and we're one of the oldest leagues in the country, formed in 1920, even before the 19th Amendment passed. We have approximately 300 men, women, and also teenagers can join. If you're 16 years or older, you can join the league. We do, as I said before, we do a variety of different services, voter services, but we're also an advocacy and a political organization advocating for social change. And we encourage everyone to join the league, and there's a variety of ways that you can contribute to voter registration drives, to public education campaigns, to helping with fundraisers, to a variety of ways in which you can participate. We have a pretty significant presence in conservation efforts in the Montgomery County area. And Kathleen Turner has been our leader on that issue for several years. We also attend naturalization ceremonies with newly sworn in citizens to the United States, and we're there at those naturalization ceremonies to register voters for the first time. So we do a variety of different things, and there's a role for everyone to play in the league, or you can just join and be part of keeping yourself educated about the current issues.
So Jennifer's also wondering how active it is compared to, say, the 70s or 80s, et cetera. Is it more or less active now than it would have been?
The League of Women Voters? Actually, we have had a big increase in the numbers of people joining the league. And I think it's also due to the fact that we're seeing more and more women interested in running for office and running and winning. So, and of course, everyone is, the news media is going crazy over who vice president, who Joe Biden is going to pick for his vice president, knowing that it's going to be a woman. So I think there's been an arousal of interest on the part of many women to participate in the political process, which is great.
Great. And I think you mentioned that men can join.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
And in fact, we have many male politicians are very active. We do public forums. We had the Secretary of State, Frank LaRose, come, and we hosted him for a meet and greet with Montgomery County and Greene County residents last year. Former Sheriff Phil Plummer, who used to be head of the Republican Party in Montgomery County, has been a longstanding member, and new politicians. Most politicians know it's probably a good idea to have the League of Women Voters on your side, because they are a powerful organization, given the fact that they are very scrupulous about being nonpartisan and providing facts and information so that voters can make reasoned decisions about public issues.
And so Tiffany's wondering if we can add, she asked, will there be a link to sign up in the resource list? So I'm assuming, Tiffany, that you mean, will there be contact information for the league in the follow-up email? And we can definitely do that. We'll definitely plan on doing that, so you have that opportunity to connect with them. And then another question from Kathleen. Do you know how many women are running for national office in 2020 in state office?
I do not, but you could go to Emily's list, which is a group that supports Democratic women candidates. So that's a resource. You could probably check with the Republican Party, the National Republican Party, and also ask them how many women are running for their party. I'm sure they would have that information. So the parties are one way to find out how many women are running for office, but off the top of my head, I don't know. But I know it's increasing. Every election cycle, we see more and more women getting interested and involved in politics at all levels, local, state, and federal.
It's true. Well, excellent. We are just about at 3 o'clock, so that's an hour. That's a good time. So I want to thank you, Dianne, for a wonderful presentation, and also for all the answers to your questions. It's been fantastic. And like I said, we will share the League's contact information. So if people have further questions, they can follow up with you that way, if that works for you.
And thanks to Wright Library and to you, Brian Potts, for sponsoring this.
Well, glad to do it. All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone, and have a good rest of your afternoon. I will be sending out a follow-up email with the reading list and resource list, along with that contact information. So look for that.